Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the BME Life. So today we have a very special guest. This is Etienne Nichols. He is a senior marketing manager and host of the Global Medical Device podcast at Greenlight Guru. And he also happens to be a mechanical engineer by training. So we've invited him here today to talk to us about what it's like to be a mechanical engineer that goes into a medtech industry. Because, like I shared this with you, Etienne, before, that it's a question we get a lot. Share that it's a question you get a lot. So yeah, we'll just talk about it, see how Etienne made it work, his advice, and we'll just learn from him today. So yeah, Etienne, again, thank you so much for being here. And then I'll just ask you to please introduce yourself to us.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, don't let the senior marketing thing scare you. So I started as a mechanical engineer working in the aerospace industry. It was really fun. I was doing we were doing destructive testing on custom aircraft interiors. Probably if I lived in Oklahoma, I might still be doing that. It was a great job. If you're in Oklahoma, let me know and I'll put you in touch with those guys. It's super fun. I moved to Ohio because my wife's family was in Ohio, and I got a job at it's called X-Tech. It was a steel industry where we were working on gears, like every mechanical engineer should at some point. It was a great job, but I wanted to be in medtech, so I took the first opportunity I could as a manufacturing engineer for it was Integra Life Sciences. It was a great company working on neurosurgical equipment and cranial fixation. So what I did there, like any manufacturing engineer, I've worked on, making things more streamlined, more efficient. But at the same time, I was learning med tech as well, because coming from steel into med tech it was a tough transition, honestly. I know you have maybe some questions about that later on down the road, but my career path, when I wanted to be in med tech, it was difficult to try to go with no experience, not being a biomedical engineer. A lot of times that's what they wanted. So it was a little bit difficult. So that's why I took the first opportunity I could. Um, did the best I could, was promoted to a project manager, got my PMP, moved on to another company working on a drug delivery combination product as a product development engineer. And that's when I found the B2B SaaS company that I'm working for now, Greenlight Guru, where we actually provide software for medical device companies for their document management systems, quality management solutions, and so forth. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell, maybe a little bit rambly, but where I'm from and who I am.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome trajectory summary. I think that's great. And I would love to kind of go back and dissect some pieces of that. So I guess initially, it's interesting that you decided to pursue mechanical engineering, went into airspace, which is kind of something that I makes sense when you think of mechanical engineers, like you mentioned gears, it's like, okay, it makes sense. And then decided to go into med tech. So when you decided, like when you were a college student and decided that mechanical engineering would be your major, like what did you have in mind with that? Were you thinking of airspace? Were you just open to all the industries, or what were you thinking
Yeah,
about?
good question. And it's hard to answer because I really was open to any and everything. Like a lot of engineering students, I thought engineering would be just like engineering school, which if, gone through engineering school and actually had a real engineering job, you realize a lot of the math, a lot of the physics, maybe you're not doing the true design that you thought you'd be doing if you were in the true engineering. But I was open to any part of the industry. That said, I really wanted to be in med tech because of a couple different things. My wife, when she and I were dating, I found out she had a pacemaker. She's had a pacemaker since she was 11, and so that was really intriguing to me. I thought, man, if I could design pacemakers, that would be like you have made it. I also broke my arm during engineering school, and the doctor who installed a plate in my arm told me about the company Synthes Dupuy. I can't pronounce their last name, but the Synthes plate and the screws, and talked about the physics behind it, which really intrigued me and made me even more interested. And I wanted to switch to biomedical engineering, but it was a little bit too late at that point. So at least in my mind, it was. And so I just went ahead and pursued with the ultimate goal of eventually getting into medtech. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. It's very fun to just hear how, what's the reasoning behind you choosing your degree. So that's very cool. And were there any sort of like internships that you took during your undergrad career that you think also kind of directed your path a little bit, or was it more like an opportunistic kind of thing?
It's a good question. So there were a couple things that I did. I actually interned at the aerospace company that I ultimately worked for right after graduation, but also I worked at the extension office. So I'll tell you a little trick that I did. So I don't know if I should even be publishing this. I've never told this on when it's being recorded, but I'll tell you anyway. So the way we worked our senior projects, they usually, okay, let me back up a little bit. We had an extension office for the college. And that extension office hired a lot of senior level or almost senior level engineers. And what we did was we provided engineering to underprivileged areas of the state. So that was one of my jobs. So I thought, hey, that would be really fun. I get to work with other students. I also get to work an actual engineering job, you know. And then I found out a lot of the senior projects were taken from that pool of work that they were doing. And then for a senior project, they would just do a lot of the work that I was doing. So when I went to my senior project and they said, hey, we have these different options, when mine came up, it wasn't the flashiest project, but I raised my hand because I was actually going to be doing that job anyway. And don't tell anybody. So I'd kind of double dipped a little bit. I got paid to do my senior project, and
Awesome.
I made full disclosure. I made sure everybody understood. But working at the extension office and getting to see all of that work done, and going to those other places, whether it was underprivileged engineering and manufacturing, it was really great because I had the opportunity to be in charge of a project and actually calling vendors. I was actually working on drawings, and we had stage reviews with the company. So that was really beneficial. So if your company or if you're in university and it offers something like that, that's a huge benefit, I feel like, as far as it really helped my final trajectory of getting into
Yeah.
project management.
Yeah, no, that definitely sounds like a great opportunity. And, I guess moving a few steps forward, whenever you found your first medtech role, like, was that kind of like, even though it was in the medtech industry, was it still similar to what you had been doing before, or was it like completely different?
It was completely different, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. So as a manufacturing engineer on the in more unregulated environment, I would
Mm.
work to make things a little bit more streamlined, obviously, and try to make sure everything worked well. When I got into med tech and worked in manufacturing, I'm just using that example. We could get into product development at some point if you like. But when I got into manufacturing for a med tech, there were things like IQ, OQ, PQs that you had to be very detailed with, and I'll just so installation qualification of a piece of machine, operational qualification, and then a performance qualification. All of those things need to be done on pieces of equipment that are developing medical devices. And there's a lot of documentation around those. There's a lot of requirements and signatures that need to be signed off and so forth. So that was a new thing to me. If you wanted to make the process more efficient, if you wanted to change a part, there was a lot of revisiting the DHF, the design
Mhm.
history file,
Mhm.
and making sure that you weren't making any unnecessary changes that would need to be validated again or verified. And so there were a lot of differences, and a lot of it was around the regulations for me.
Talking about what you do now as a marketing manager is, marketing already sounds like completely different to the engineering. How did you start getting into more of the marketing side of engineering? Was that something that you always kind of liked, or you started growing that liking with time?
Yeah, it's a circuitous journey to where I am now. So I was working as a project manager for a drug delivery combination product company. 2020 hit. Obviously, it was difficult for everybody. And I wasn't really looking for a job at the time, but I read an article. It was actually by Jessica Lyons. It was a great article called DHF versus DMR versus DHR. So if you haven't read that article, I can, send it to you. Maybe we can put it in the show notes. And I read that article. I reached out to the author on LinkedIn, and I tell you this story in detail because I think this is it's sometimes a good pattern to follow. I reached out to this person on LinkedIn, said, "Hey, really enjoyed your article." And she said, cool, that was great. So we connected. The next day she posted, hey, we had a great quarter last quarter. And by the way, we're hiring. And I thought, what are you hiring for? So I just was curious, looked at it. It was very interesting. The company looked interesting. I thought it was a media company at the time, and so I applied just to learn more about it. And they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I started working with customers to help them understand the regulations, help them understand the software that they were producing, and to make sure that they were able to get their products to market. Well, just to kind of speed you up and speed this story up to the end, I was continuing to post on LinkedIn occasionally of things I would learn, like, I just learned Part 820.30 talking about design control. You don't actually have to have more than one design review. Did you know that? Just things like that. And the founder of the company watched my LinkedIn and reached out to me, just put something on my calendar, said, "Hey, I have an idea." Well, I came to the meeting very terrified, thinking I was like, what have I done wrong? And he said, "Would you like to be my co-host for the podcast?" And I said, "Okay, yeah, absolutely." So he invited me to be the podcast guy, and he was trying to get out of that job. And now I am in charge of the Global Medical Device podcast. And so that's why I'm under marketing. That's part of the reason. And so I still get to talk to industry professionals. I still get to talk to customers and about the regulations, about quality. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I wound up in the current role that I'm doing.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And right now I'm realizing that I totally forgot to mention in the beginning that reason that we're even here today is that I listened to a lot of your global medical device podcasts. Like, I think I've been a fan of the podcast for years now. I think when I was like doing my internship, like we started working on like a 510K, and I was like, what is a 510K, or how to put a 510K, and just like started looking at podcasts, listening to podcasts, and eventually ran into the global medical device podcast. And ever since then, just been listening to it. And I just want to say that for anyone who's out there and wants to learn more about the industry, like, please check out these podcasts because they are so amazing. Like, I always love listening to them. So yeah, thank you so much for all the work that you and Greenlight Group put out there. It's really amazing.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I definitely recommend. A lot of it's not something I do. I get to interview all these people, but yeah, it's been a great opportunity. And I actually have kind of 5 little tips I would give your audience if I could just go through a few
Yeah,
different things.
yeah, please.
I was actually thinking about that. If I were to give advice to myself before coming to medtech, what would I give, a mechanical engineer who's never worked in the design and development, from a regulatory perspective? So one of the first things I would tell them is that the regulations should be your first stop for reading, not your last. So there's a lot of resources out there, and I highly recommend them all. But one of the things you should not, put to the last is actually reading the regulations. So if you've never read Part 820, it'll only take you less than an hour, but you'll understand a whole lot more about why you have to go through the design controls process. Why do you have to have design inputs, design outputs? I mean, it's a regulatory requirement. So
Yes.
when you join, and in fact, when you join a medtech company, they'll have you read SOP after SOP to train you. And that, okay, great. But the rules that those SOPs are built off of are ISO 13485, ISO 14971, and so forth, Part 820. So it would have been so much easier for me to assimilate into the medtech industry if I had known and read those regulations. So that's my first tip. This is going to be very rambly, so I'm going to stop and see if you have any thoughts first.
No, no. I mean, I think that's a great tip. I especially coming from as a mechanical engineer, where I think maybe, and this is just my assumption because I'm obviously not a mechanical engineer, but I feel like mechanical engineer is the most like hands-on engineering type, and like maybe they expect to be doing a lot of design and like not so much like documentation kind of work. So I think it might be a shock for some people to enter the industry and realize that 80% of the work or more is documentation, depending on your role, of course. And yeah, specifically in the medtech industry, like regulations are so important. So I think that's great advice. And definitely, if there's a mechanical engineer thinking of getting into the industry, like maybe like you, they've been in airspace before and they don't really know anything about medtech, I definitely agree. Like, for example, just like reviewing the code of federal regulations before your interviews or things like that will just give you, some insight into the industry that might look good and just give you a learning opportunity as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. mechanical engineers, they're the jacks of all trade, but the masters of none. You're exposed to electrical, expected to know how to use CAD, probably have a good grasp of physics. That said, you probably don't know anything about biocompatibility, that side of the conversation, and there's a steep learning curve when it comes to regulations. And I'd be interested. So having not studied BME in university, I don't know how to characterize it necessarily. So I might be interested in your characterization about the positive and negatives versus mechanical engineering.
That's very funny that you asked that because I think in the beginning of our conversation here, you mentioned something about medical device companies preferring BMEs over Mechis sometimes. And I totally had like the opposite experience, or at least
Ah,
what I heard, and these are all things that I've heard. But some, people will say like, oh, BME is not really like a good degree because kind of the same thing. You're a jack of all trades. Like you learn a little bit of biology and a little bit of anatomy and a little bit of engineering. And so it's just funny that we're actually all in the same boat, like everyone's struggling. But you know, I think as a BME, one of the advantages is that if you're going into the med tech industry, and of course there's other things you can do, but that's one of the most common ones. And just having that ability to communicate between the medical and the engineering kind of sides of the medtech industry, I think is really important. Maybe something that someone with that's a mechie like doesn't really have necessarily like the lingo or things like that. So that might be one advantage, but I also think that's something that's you learn with time, like even as someone who took BME, like I'm still learning every time I get a new project. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is talking about the brain and it's talking about, I have to now learn the brain, like the neurology terms. So you're always learning, and I feel like that's going to be true no matter what you are.
yeah, that's a good point. Um, that's a really good point. Okay, so the second tip that I would give you just in general, this is really more just a general engineering tip. If you're getting into engineering, the problem is more important than the solution. And that's kind of like counterintuitive maybe, but
Mhm.
during the design and development process of a medical device, Part 820.30 requires something called user needs, which I know you're probably very familiar with. And later on, it requires that you validate those needs. And validating user needs, there's some tough stuff around verification versus validation. Validating is making sure that you designed the correct device. Not that you made it correctly, but that you made the correct device. So a
Mhm.
lot of companies, they fall in love with their technology and their solution. And let's face it, that's an engineer's temptation. That's my temptation. But they don't truly understand the problem. And so that can cause problems down the line. So that's my second tip is the problem is more important than the solution for engineers. So
Yeah.
in my 5 tip, sermon here.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great point. And I remember that was one of the lessons that they really tried to like drill in our brains, while I think especially during like your last year, like your final project. It's like you really have to understand the need, and if there is an actual need. And it's funny that you bring it up because I think just last week one of my colleagues was telling me about how one time like there was this specific user need that the client kind of a certain company overlooked, and they didn't really implement into the device, and then they developed the full thing, and it wasn't until the end that they realized that it's not what they needed, it's not what users need, and they completely failed, and the company lost a lot of money. So it's not a fun place to be for sure. So yeah, I think if we can get in that mentality, that's the way to go.
That's cool. I mean, it's not cool. It's sad, but it's interesting. It's great that you have that, like hands-on real world. You've seen that, that's powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the third point, and I just put these together just because I wanted to make sure that you had something to walk away with. But the third point is good design requires good documentation. And you already talked. I mean, I was surprised that you said 80%, but you're probably right, and it probably is higher. The 80% of a lot of the med tech job is documentation.
Yep.
It takes a long time to bring that device to fruition. And there does need to be solid justification for any future changes that happen along the way. So learning to embrace documentation, it really is a must to succeed in medical devices. So that is another tip that if I were telling my old mechanical engineer self, like good design requires good documentation.
Yep. Nope. Totally agree with that. And, I think as a student, you kind of dread thinking of documentation, but it's definitely the real world. And I don't know about you, but you kind of learn to love it in some way. Like I now, I'll enjoy like drafting requirements and user needs and things like that. Like I can lose track of time doing that. So yeah, I think there's space for someone to grow to love it. Like if there's someone thinking, oh no, like never mind, I don't want to go into the medtech industry because I don't want to document, 80% of the time. Like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like you could learn to love it, but it's also something to consider if you absolutely hate it.
That is true. And I kind of wish I'd been warned about it, but I agree. I mean, you can get lost in it if you're really thinking about kind of with the end in mind. It
Mhm.
really is kind of cool. It's almost like its own little design project. Every piece of document that you write is going to be read in some way or assimilated into a work instruction or whatever. And that is a little bit of a design project because if it's misunderstood, then it will be misused. So I don't know. I agree. I think it can be fun after a while. You just gotta get into that mindset.
Yeah, totally agree.
And so this fourth point is probably true for any industry, but maintaining cross-functional awareness is super important. This is kind of an engineer's, especially a young engineer's fallacy in that we know everything. And I think it's gotten a lot better. Most engineers get that we don't know everything, but you need a relationship with quality, manufacturing, marketing, field services. Whoever interacts with the device that you're working on, whether it's assembly, inspection, sales, repair, they have valuable input that may never reach you unless you maintain those relationships with other departments. I'll just tell you a quick story about this. I was once put in a cubicle directly outside the break room, and which they always called this the cursed cubicle when I started. And I'm like, why? They said no one's lasted more than 2 months in this cubicle. I'm like, what's up with this cubicle? So people would come out of the break room and they would either have to turn left or right or come directly into my cubicle. And the way I sat, I would make eye contact with them. And I started logging how many people came in to say hi to me. And it was like 30 or 40, maybe even 50 people in a day. So if you
Wow.
like just a few minutes, that becomes a couple hours. And I wasn't getting anything done. Well,
Yeah.
finally I realized, what if I try to make friends with every person who comes in here? So the next guy who came in, I'm like, hey, I'm struggling with this Excel thing. He said, oh, you just do this, this, and this. And it was done. And pretty soon I was doing more work than anybody else on that cubicle row
Wow.
just because I was harnessing the people around me. But that's just a simple example, but you really need to maintain awareness of the people you're working with. It can really, and the cross-functional awareness is really important in medtech, I believe.
Yeah, no,
What?
I agree. And, truthfully, I don't have much experience with actually experiencing that cross functionality because I've always worked in like kind of like consulting outside like external firms. So I've never really been in an actual, like manufacturer company where like all the different departments are there. And I think there's so much value in being able to experience that as well. But I can totally see it even as an external kind of more like consulting role. There needs to be that communication between you, the engineers, and all the different roles. So yeah, I think that's great advice.
Yeah. And the fifth one's pretty easy that I had, and it's really just all the different resources that are out there. Obviously, I suggest people reading the regulations, but sometimes we forget about guidance documents.
Mm,
Guidance documents explain the government's interpretation of their own regulations. So that's something to think about. Um, Another one would be online academies. And I'll just, if I could,
yes.
promote, we have academy.greenlight.guru. It's a free academy. There is a paid section, but there's a lot of free stuff there. You can learn about design controls, learn about quality management systems, and so forth. And then there's LinkedIn where professionals are expressing their opinions on whether it's risk management or design validation and so forth. So I highly recommend curating your feed in LinkedIn just so you see more than just job updates from the people you went to college with. So definitely curate your feeds for that. And industry specific forums is the last thing I'll say. There are industry specific forums like community.greenlight.guru and others, but that's one that we're working on as well. So those are just that's kind of my 5 point thought on just a Mechie coming out of trying to get into medtech.
No, that's great advice. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. I think it's, very valuable advice that any interested Mechies can take home. But yeah, I think we're pretty much near the end of our conversation. I think I just wanted to ask you like a few more things, or really
Yeah.
just um one thing is, now that you're in the medtech industry, do you see a lot of mechies in the medtech industry, or would you say there's, what's the distribution like?
Yeah, it really is. It's hard to say. Maybe even 60-40 in the companies I've worked in. There's a lot of Meckies in the medical device industry.
Yeah, no, I would think so, but yeah, that's amazing. And I know you asked me about advantages or disadvantages of being a BME. Do you see any advantages that, if you're a Mechie, they should feel proud of? Oh yeah, I'm a Mechie. I have this advantage. What would you say?
Oh yeah, I'm actually going to borrow some of the words you said. You have a really good grasp of the physical world. You typically can see how things work and fit together. I'm sure all of the engineering disciplines teach you how to think really critically, but I was really impressed with the way um, you go all the way upstream to the molecular level and come back, and you know the strength of your part. So I mean, that's just one example, using physics to really understand the value of your part. But um, I think Mechies have a really good distribution of knowledge, and it helps them work cross-functionally. For example, if you're willing to explore that side of, a lot of us, um, if you're willing to explore that side of your personality. One person told me that engineers, the way you learn from an introverted from an extroverted is an introverted engineer stares at his shoes while he's talking to you, and an extroverted engineer will stare at your shoes while he's talking to you. So, but explore outside that shell, and that's maybe one of the benefits I see.
Yeah, no, I that sounds great. And I had one more question and I think I completely lost it. Oh yeah. So as a Mechie, we kind of talked about the heavy documentation problem with, or not problem, but you know, fact.
Situation. Yeah.
Yeah, being in the medtech industry. Um, are there any roles as mechies in the medtech industry that don't necessarily like I'm sorry, let me rephrase the question. What kind of different roles within the medtech industry could a mechie expect?
Well, manufacturing is an obvious one. That's a very easy switch to manufacturing. Product development is very heavy in making sure everything is design controls oriented, so it's a little bit harder, but R&D for sure. I can see a research and development engineering position being very an easy transition. Um, Project management as well, because a lot of mechies are taught a lot of project management skills as they go through school. But manufacturing is the one that probably filters up to the very top. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, awesome. Well, I think those were all my questions. Really, now I would like to ask you, if I'm a Mechie, think whether I'm graduating college soon or have been in a different industry for a while, but curious about the medtech industry, what would be like your one or few words of advice for them?
It's not going to be the coolest advice, but my advice is if you're interested in the mechie industry, the one thing I would say is read part 820.30, maybe part 820, all of part 820. It's probably only 5 pages long. But 21 CFR Part 820, it's free to find online. It's the Code of Federal Regulations around quality management systems and design controls. And that will give you the core of what the difference in medtech versus every other industry, because that really is what sets them apart. That and the fact that you're working on something that could potentially save or kill a human life. So there's a very heavy element to that, but those are the regulations that set those apart. So that's what I would say. That's the biggest piece of advice that I would give.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure it's very well appreciated. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge. It was definitely great talking to you. And yeah, I think now we'll just say bye to the audience. But again, really, really appreciate your time, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who will really benefit from this conversation.
Cool. Thanks, Mary. Really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's great for the industry, and I wish I had known to look for someone like you on YouTube or wherever when I was going
Oh,
through it. It's really cool. I really appreciate what you're doing.
thank you. Thank you so much. That means a lot. All right. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.